Hey, welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Bourbon Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Terry McGraw from Cape Endeavors Incorporated. And today our guest is Tony Kirtley from IBM's X-Force and Incident Response Team. Thanks again, Tony, for joining us. It's been a while since we've talked in public, so thank you for being on the podcast.
Absolutely, Terry. Thanks for having me.
No worries, brother. Hey, so for the audience benefit, Tony and I, we go back a really long way, but for the benefit of everyone else, so you are an incident response commander, incident response expert. Give me a little history about sort of where you came from and how you got to the IBM X Force.
Okay. Well, incident response in cybersecurity for me kind of dropped in my lap. I spent a career in the Army National Guard. And during the course of my career in the National Guard, they developed computer emergency response teams. And I joined that team. And they subsequently had to change the name because of a copyright issue. But regardless, it got me started in cybersecurity and directly into incident response. And I took that experience and changed my career from civil engineering to cybersecurity about 25 years ago, and have had various roles in cybersecurity, never venturing too far from incident response. It's really what I love. I love the challenge of it. I love the urgency of it. And I think my blood pressure actually goes down in an incident because I'm able to hyper focus on a specific problem, and the world just, waits. It doesn't, but to me, it's like I put the blinders on and solve the problem. But so I spent some time in industry managing incident response teams, creating incident response teams for organizations, and couple of bouts in consulting, doing various roles in cybersecurity, and prior to IBM, ended up at SecureWorks as an incident response consultant and then a director. And then about a year ago, moved to IBM X-Force to lead their global incident response team. And so that's where I'm at today.
Well, that's a laudatory history. You and I have been on some of the largest engagements in the world. Literally, you and I have collectively been on some of the largest incident response engagements that the world has seen. So as I look back on the landscape, I've said this kind of snarkily several times that the top three initial access vectors are still the top three. AI, all that stuff just accelerates the same top three, which is malware born through spear phishing, stolen credentials enabled by really poor MFA or other controls, and then unpatched systems or software like 0-day.
Hey, what I've seen though, Terry, sorry to interrupt, but just it, and that depends on your perspective. So since I've been at IBM, I went from, managing and responding to small to medium enterprise customers to large enterprise with IBM. And it's slightly different from our perspective. We found third-party breaches to be a major attack vector for some of our clients. So I would caution anyone who looks at a report or just have this caveat when looking at our cost of the data breach or Verizon's DBIR report to consider the source of the information, because it can vary widely. But you're absolutely right. The three that you mentioned have historically and will, I think, in the future.
That was going to be my question is that, okay, so that was historically the top three. But what are you seeing from your perspective? Are there, I mean, obviously the third party, I'm laughing a little bit because, I've talked to sort of Alison Wyckoff and Alexander Rose, and we've fellow IR folks and threat researchers. And we kind of laugh that, yes, that's third party. but it's invariably one of those top three
Yeah.
that affected the third party, right? So you're inheriting their lack of the top three initial access vector control. So are you seeing that? Is that consistent? I mean,
Yes.
give us a little information on what would surprise us in the threat landscape that we haven't heard about, if anything.
Um, Not really anything, because what has historically worked still works.
Mhm.
I think that organizations still haven't done the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity to plug the holes that allow those threat actors to do the same thing year after year. We are seeing them scale through third party breaches. Like right now, the Sales Loft
Mm.
breach,
Yep.
enabling attackers to get information from all kinds of organizations, very prominent organizations as well. So uh, they're doing some of the same things, but they're leveraging those attack vectors to, pivot from one organization to another.
Much
Um,
larger scale.
and you mentioned AI, and we're seeing phishing attacks become more believable. The language in the phishing is better. Um, I don't know that we've seen the actual code being developed by AI or be that much different. But everyone has that in mind, that the code that's developed uh, for malware is being developed using AI, or attacks are automated through AI. I don't think we're seeing, at least in my perspective, we're not seeing that quite
Have
be
you
commonplace
seen
yet.
any firsthand? I mean, I've read articles about generative AI and voice fake, like for the help desk compromise, meaning
Hmm.
calling in and pretending to be an employee. Is that, do we really see a AI version of that, or is it just still people calling in and humans talking to other humans?
I haven't personally seen that in any of our engagements, and I've been here 1 year, but we haven't seen that personally. But
Mhm.
not saying that it's not happening elsewhere, though.
Right.
I think it's certainly possible.
And all your experience in doing this, and you've been doing it a long time, even longer than I have, which is staggering to me. But what would surprise someone, like someone listening to this? What would, from all of your experience and all of the small and the large and the super large insert response engagements you do, is there something that's surprising that you've seen that's common through those things that someone who's never experienced that wouldn't really fully grasp?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprises me the most is how woefully inadequate organizations' asset management really is. I've seen incidents where the client organization, they're surprised that some of the assets that we find are compromised, that they didn't know they had, or the data that they own that's supposedly important to them, they have no idea where it sits, or you know the uh, where it sits in the organization, and so therefore they're not securing it. And another thing is, and we can pull in that asset management, because I think it's a huge shortcoming in a lot of organizations. But another thing is, I almost want to say never seen an organization literally pull out their incident response plan when I, as a consultant, have parachuted in to help them. I don't see them leveraging their incident response plan. Everyone seems to try to shoot from the hip, which baffles me. I know that they have them. What is it, a paper drill?
Well, I
So
guess that would be the conclusion. Is it really is a check the block? It's a compliance, not necessarily a well-oiled machine at that point. Do you
mhm.
see that as a common thread? Is that folks don't actually exercise their IR plan? That it gets written and put on the shelf, and
I think there are organizations that don't exercise. Of course, the organizations that we deal with, we're doing that for them. We're doing tabletop exercises for our retainer clients on a periodic basis. It's built into the agreement that we have with them. So our retainer clients are doing that, but I know there are organizations out there that aren't paying attention to this and aren't prepared for that cyber breach.
Yeah.
So,
I
yeah.
I personally, what I always found interesting, comparing sort of the proactive approach where you're doing tabletops and you're asking hard questions, and versus, you actually had a breach, much less a ransomware, is it how few decision makers in a business handle the questions that they don't need the crisis to answer. Like the amount of people that wait until they actually have a data breach to say, or a ransomware, God forbid, like, do we even pay? Like, what's the financial rubric that we would have to, like, what's our threshold of pain? Like, what's our messaging? Who do we
Hmm.
tell? Like, all of the things that you could easily answer in a non-crisis environment, tend to still wait until they're in a crisis to go answer. Do you find that to be the case, or are people getting better at that?
People are getting better. I was going to say that, the we would see that all the time, where it's sometimes it takes a company to get breached itself to wake up and start to pay attention to what to do in that breach. But it is getting better as you see headline after headline of companies getting breached. Then the executive teams and boards are paying attention to that, especially if it happens in their own industry. Boards pay attention and executives pay attention very closely to their competitors and are they keeping up and everything. Nobody wants to be left behind. So I think it's getting better, but we've always got work to do. And, there's always going to be those organizations that have their head in the sand saying that won't happen to me, because I don't have anything that, an attacker would target me for. But as well as I do that, nobody is safe from that scenario, especially when it's indiscriminate. If you have a weakness, you're going to be targeted.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is opportunistic. A lot of it is opportunistic. What I always say, though, is that when you're looking at it from a business risk, you also have to look at who your customers are and who your relationships are,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you just mentioned third party supply chain compromise. Well, whose supply chain are you? Like, I mean, where are you in that supply chain that
Right.
you are the initial access vector for someone else? You might not have anything that you think is worth it. I told this story because it was a true story from a long time ago. There was a Middle Eastern company who did logistics and supply, for the U.S. government in downrange, and they had a data breach. It was a compromise, and the leadership couldn't understand, like, why the hell anybody would want to get into a legit, like, milk and cheese and supply runs, like, what was so important. But what they didn't understand is that they had access to physical locations and deliveries, and it was badging criteria
Hmm.
and scheduling and procedures, and that was really what the adversary was after. It had nothing to do with their company. It had everything to do with the physical compromise of something else, and that became an issue. And so, I always say that it's part of your overall business risk mitigation strategy that you have to think about this. Are there other things that as a corporate entity, at the board and C-suite level, that they need to consider about IR? Like, what do you recommend a C-suite and a board consider that may not be obvious to them?
Um, there's the obvious things of have professional organizations on your side to be ready to help, like a law firm, cyber insurance provider, an IR firm. And there's the obvious things of, what are going to be my breach requirements contractually or regulatory, um, reporting requirements. And I think that what may be overlooked, so those things are obvious, right? Everybody, I think, gets that. I, but the internal relationships, the internal decision making, uh, the internal coordination, I think maybe sometimes gets overlooked. Like, and I think a key part of an incident response plan is the the part that specifies the roles and responsibilities. Like, who makes what decisions? Who is authorized to make a decision about containment of certain parts of the environment, because of the business impact it might cause? So identifying those roles and responsibilities and the coordination requirements internally to make decisions in a timely manner, I think is some of the less obvious parts of incident response that executives need to be concerned about.
So I had on Jody Blanchard. You and I know from
Yeah.
our previous work, and he was because he lived through a couple of these incidents, and he said his advice is understand unity of command. Right? He was using very like you and I are both from military backgrounds, and so it was language that we understood. But from your experience as a civilian incident response commander, can you describe what Jody means by unity of command? I think it goes along with what you just said, but when you're as an incident response commander, what does that really mean to the company that's involved in this?
Yeah, I would say it just means that everyone needs to be on the same page and understand who makes those decisions that I was talking about. Um, what roles have what responsibilities, and everyone understanding that. And that's where incident response planning comes into play. And not only the planning, but the exercising, because you can uncover things in an exercise that you may not have anticipated in when developing your plan. Uh, we as professional incident response consultants will develop scenarios, real world scenarios, to put in front of our clients in an exercise, and it makes them think. As you know, Terry, you've sat through a bunch of these. It makes them think about what they would do in their specific situation. Every environment, every company is different, and so they need to work out those issues and come together on who is going to resolve them. And so to me, that's what the unity of command means in an incident response scenario.
I think touching a little bit more on sort of the communication of what you say, what you don't say. You and I both seen our engagements, like the Uber that went horribly bad, and Amnesty International, which I would argue went really well based on how they handled the communication, both externally and internally. So touching on this just a little bit. So I think one of the things that people don't consider is internal communication strategy, right? Because nature abhors a vacuum. Your employees are probably the first people to know something's amiss. What is that internal communication strategy, and have you worked that out? And then what do you recommend for external communications? Like, how do you not say too much or say too little? Like that, what's that balance? So, do you have practical advice for folks on comms?
Yeah, internally, um, organizations don't want to put out what they don't expect to end up in the press.
Hmm.
And I've seen organizations say we've had a cybersecurity breach when they don't have to internally to their organizations. And a lot of this depends on the culture of the organization. Some organizations pride themselves on being completely transparent to build trust with their employee base. And so it's going to depend on the culture of the organization. But I've seen a strategy that's effective be used that is um, blame it on the network. If we have an outage, you have outages that are not human caused, that are machine based outages that are normal, that you handle with your normal incident management process. And so those things happen. So when you have like a ransomware caused outage or a breach or an attack, uh, you can at first leverage that and there's plausible deniability perhaps in that, but be careful about what I think the message is: be deliberate and be thoughtful about what you communicate, even internally.
Yeah, I've found that it goes one of two ways. Either uh, uh, decision makers decide to try to obfuscate, that there is a real issue, or B, they make a hyperbole where,
Yeah.
this was an advanced threat and blah, it thwarted all over. I mean, so they'll either A, grossly overstate what actually happened, and then when the truth comes out, it was like someone did something stupid, or they had unpatched stuff in their environment for 12 years, or conversely, they try to underplay it. Where they don't release what happens, and then later it becomes, where they're culpable. I think that truthfully, I always try to tell people to find a balance. Be
Hmm.
clear, but don't get ahead of the forensics.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the friend, and it takes a while to build out this, because there are compliant environments right now that require 24, 48, 72-hour notice to government agencies or stakeholders, but you probably don't know what happened fully in 24, 48, or 72 hours. And so
Yeah,
I
usually
always
not.
caution about go with the bare minimum while you can until
Hmm.
you can paint a clear picture, because you'll get yourself, it's way harder to wind stuff back if you grossly overstate what's going on.
Yeah, and externally it becomes more sensitive because the implications or the consequences are much more grave. And in this case, if it's bad enough, if it's a data breach and you suspect there's a lot of PII that's involved, or PHI, or sensitive data of any kind that affects many people, then I would suggest getting a professional involved. And there are professional communications organizations out there that can help you manage the messaging. And so I highly recommend that if it's the stakes are high enough, because saying the wrong thing can get executives fired.
Yeah,
You
or
know,
or in prison.
yeah, and can lead to class action lawsuits and everything like that. So
So
the
that's
messaging externally is much more sensitive for the timing, the content, the
yeah.
all of that.
I
And so again, this comes back to planning, because you can kind of tease out what a holding statement might look like for a data breach, given the data that you have that could be breached. Do the worst case scenario. If you have a lot of PII and that PII is breached, what would you say in the initial stages
mm,
to kind of be to make yourself appear to be transparent, but yet protect yourself at the same time?
yeah. I'd like to pull that a little bit more, because that's I think a really salient point here is in the data portion of these data breaches. It used to be that you waited, a malicious binary would lock up the environment, and that was going to be the operational punch, and that's what brought
Hmm.
people to the negotiation table if you're a terrorist. But but the extortion tactics seem have moved to the data piece, and I don't think people fully understand that the litigation of this and the post breach kind of costs are much higher usually than an operational outage. Do you find that to be the truth? And is data theft still the extortion tactics of preference right now?
It is. And I think it depends on the data, it depends on the organization as to the operational or the cost of the impact of the data breach versus the operational outage. I saw a relatively small organization that had ransomware, and though they were able to recover the data, the thought of, or the threat of a data breach compelled them to pay,
Right.
because it wasn't a PII kind of data. It was data about their biggest customer, which comprised 40% of their revenue. So if that data were to be leaked, they would lose that customer, and essentially their business would change if it was even able to keep going. So the data breach was what compelled them to pay. Now we're seeing encryptionless ransomware. It's
Mhm.
basically extortion, data breach extortion at that point, where there's not a business outage, but rather just the data breach element of it.
Which does seem, and I don't think folks fully, unless you've done this, you don't fully appreciate the cost of your litigation team, much less those that are going to be brought to bear against you as an entity, for potential disclosure or litigation because of that data breach downstream. I mean, but you're talking $1,500 per hour per member of a legal team.
Hmm.
This stuff can add up to millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions very, very quickly, depending on the scale of the breach. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, definitely. It's huge. The cost. I think the business interruption for organizations that are faced with ransomware still is the highest cost. Um, and the forensics cost, the legal cost still pale in comparison to that for a lot of organizations, but it's not insignificant at the same time.
Hmm. Yeah. So I let's pivot a little bit to our, as sort of one of those areas that you and I have talked about ad nauseum is the emotional impact
I knew you were going to
of
go
these
there.
things. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, you and I wrote a paper on it. So the question becomes, do you still coach? I mean, you now that you're at IBM, your customer base is of course some of the largest in the world, and you provide proactive and reactive. But do you still find that emotional component varying based on who you're dealing with, and what advice do you give them?
Well, I think it's different because of the maturity, the higher maturity of the clients that we deal with in large organizations, with a few exceptions. But in large part, they're more mature. They've been through incidents before, so they're a little bit battle tested. But there's still an emotional response, and you know, you and I have talked about the equating that to the Kubler-Ross grief cycle, and
Hmm.
it's so true that especially, but I think it's more true with smaller organizations that are just blindsided by something like ransomware, and it's um, the emotional response is more severe in those cases for those organizations because they could cease to exist if they
Right.
do this poorly, whereas larger organizations are shielded a little bit from that. They have a little bit better resilience, and so it's not as an emotional of an impact. But I always say our role as incident response consultants are part counselor, part firefighter, and part doctor. The counselor is as an incident commander, especially the client facing role, you're trying to manage the emotions and how those emotions play out with how a CISO deals with their team. And so it's but we as consultants who deal with this every day, it becomes less emotion ridden than it does with the victim organization because it's more of a process for us,
Yeah.
and we don't have ownership, so we can be objective and just say, hey, we're going to get through this. Here's how we're going to do it, and present that calm demeanor and kind of tamper down the emotions a little
Yeah,
bit with
I'm still
client.
staggered that a lot of IR teams that do this sort of the root cause analysis, do the forensics, do the help recover, still don't include the incident response command as part of this. I don't know how you can effectively quote unquote consult during a crisis if you have no one that's leading the crisis management for the company, or at least advising them the crisis management of the company. I just think that it's a huge piece that's missing from a lot of IR teams. Is that still true? You have this continuum of you've done this organically, you've done it for consulting, you've done it for large and small. Is that still a recommendation that you
Oh,
make?
yeah. So there's a wide range of severity of and incident types that some of which don't require an incident commander because they're isolated in nature. It may be an investigation of one host, and that can be handled just by a security manager or something in isolation. But the more wide-reaching an incident gets, the more you need that incident commander. Terry, you and I work together as incident commanders on many ransomware incidents. Ransomware is, of course, one of the most complex types of incidents that I believe needs an incident commander each time, just to manage the different work streams, the communications, recovery, the investigation, the legal aspects, all of the things, the communications with internal stakeholders, and all of that. And I believe that over the past several years, that probably the last 10 years, Actually 9 years, when enterprise ransomware first came into play in 2016 timeframe. Uh, we I think that the role of the incident commander has been diminished, has been incident response has become more commoditized
Hmm.
and boiled down to just the digital forensics aspects of it. I still believe that uh, the role of the incident commander is needed in some of the more complex incidents, and we still provide it to our clients, um, and and it's effective. Uh, and a lot of our clients accept that. But in a lot of, especially in the small to medium enterprise market, um, incident response has largely been commoditized.
Yeah, actually think that's to the detriment.
Hmm.
Particularly even not ransomware, but even in data breach scenarios, there's just so much. There's so many competing interests. There's so many competing communication streams. There's so many competing organizations, the task lists that have to be managed, and all of that comes with the human component. I in an incident response commander not only A knows all of the pieces of the incident response, but B are experts in crisis management and don't have an emotional component, and they can bring very very calm, cool, experience to the situation, which is chaotic in and of itself.
Hmm.
Not to mention you have people who've never read the IR plan, they don't know their roles. You've got a lot of people calling in to figure out what the hell happened. So I think people grossly underestimate the value of having someone like you that in the crisis can just parachute in and bring that calm, cool, leadership, calm under fire leadership that's required in crisis management.
Yeah, I think that when an organization considers what they should do themselves versus outsource, um, there's a couple of things that should play into that decision. One is how much business context uh, can the person providing this service have? So, and the more business context that's needed, the more argument there is for keeping it internal, because an external organization can never have the business context that an internal component could. The next consideration is how often do I need this capability? And for digital forensics, I hope organizations don't need it that often.
Right.
If they do, maybe they should keep it internal, but most organizations don't need it enough to have an internal capability. So they outsource it to firms like ours. And so I think that, when we do this every day for different clients, we've seen so many different types of scenarios. It's hard to surprise us anymore. And like you said, since we don't own the situation, we can apply a level of objectivity. And because we have proven tools and processes to handle all the different scenarios companies could face, we can bring that confidence and calm demeanor into the situation, because we know we're going to get through it if the client cooperates and does the things that they need to do.
So a segue into sort of my last question, and I think one that's probably the most pertinent to the audience. Given your wide breadth of experience and firsthand knowledge of these subjects and incident response, what's the top 3, 5, 10 things that you recommend to a corporate entity or small, mid-sized, doesn't matter. What advice do you give to those from that hard won experience?
Generally, it is to mature your response program, and we do that with our clients. And so, a partnership with a company like IBM and X Force to help with maturing the incident response capability is a no brainer. Um, More technically or more tactically, I would say make sure you know what your assets you have, know what's in your environment, and know how to protect it, how to track it, and all of that. And outline, as I mentioned, the roles and responsibilities, and practice them. And I have been a big proponent of focusing on Active Directory, because you know as well as I do, when you have a widespread data breach or ransomware, an Active Directory compromise is always involved. So securing Active Directory could go a long way. In fact, it probably could go the farthest with compared to the amount of effort to preventing the actions on the objective of an attacker to effectuate something like ransomware or data breach. Because, getting access to that administrative account, or an administrative account to be able to deploy ransomware widespread or get access to data that is important to the organization. If an organization can prevent that, then that's going to be key to keeping the bad things from happening.
Yeah, in almost every case I've seen, it's been privileged access management.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the privilege access management because a lot of folks think they have it. It's really in that attack path enumeration, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the service accounts. It's in the overly broad administrative accounts. It's in the system to system admin accounts that can be laterally crosswalked, and then new set of creds get accomplished, and then the next thing you know, you've moved up to you've got tier zero access, or in case of Entra ID, you've reached global admin levels. But even if you don't even get the global admin level, at the enterprise system level, you can still, turn off the EDR, for example. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff you can do at that level. I think that denying the adversary privilege access management is key to surviving one of these.
Yeah.
Um, I, I think I'd like to highlight too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but given the fact that extortion has a ubiquitous component of data theft, it's even some level, even if it's like the proof of life data that a broker might sell to another affiliate group. I do think that understanding what data, like where is the data in your environment? Who is it important to? Why is it important? And what's your litigation exposure of that data?
Right.
I don't think a lot of folks spend time thinking through that until their bad day happens. Do you
Mm-hmm.
share that view?
I do share that view, and I think that's part of an enterprise risk management capability. And that's easy for me to say as a consultant, and it's harder to do, not impossible. I think that organizations should look at risk in that kind of light across the enterprise. Like, what is the risk of their data? I
Mm-hmm.
once did an exercise with a huge healthcare provider who had health records for almost a billion people. And come to find out that a large percentage of those records were stale, no longer needed. But if they got breached, then the even though they didn't need some of those records, a large percentage of them, they would still be liable for the notification requirements that have to make on those PHI records.
Right.
So keeping, you know, sometimes those data assets can become liabilities if they're no longer needed. Let's get rid of them. Have a retention policy where
Yeah, or minimum
those
archive it
old
off.
records get, yeah.
Yeah, that's the other thing too. I think that we should mention, um, the data component, B, the privilege access management, but even in the backup strategy, I can't tell you how many times I've seen where the threat group that compromised the environment were able to compromise the backups because they were
Yeah.
using the same authentication mechanisms
Hmm.
for their backup systems as they were for the rest of their systems. It wasn't out of band. It wasn't separate creds. It was literally, it was provided through Active Directory, right? And so their systems and services, the first thing they have, the adversary goes for is backups. Do you have recommendations around that?
Yeah, there are all kinds of solutions out there to help organizations make their backups immutable and untouchable. And it's just it is an investment, and it's one of those things where organizations have to recognize the risk, recognize the need in order to justify the spend.
Right.
So I think the more we can do, Terry, you and I and others in our industry, to raise the awareness of the threats and how to mitigate those risks, um, the better organizations will be. But it's not an easy lift to implement a new backup system or an immutable backup system, but they do exist. The solutions are out there.
Yeah, and some of them are really, really good, and they're designed to
Yes.
be out of band by nature, and will say you remove one big operational headache when you do that well,
Hmm.
right? Because you can reconstitute very quickly, and you may have the data component, but at least you won't be fighting your operational outage.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I I still think the recommendations, pragmatically, are you really need to practice your worst day before you have it, right?
Hmm.
You've said that throughout this entire thing. Is that you don't wait till the crisis happens to think through the crisis. You really should practice that as part of your daily operations, and
Yeah,
then be.
because when you're going through the grief cycle, you're
Mhm.
not thinking clearly because of the high emotions of the situation. So yeah, absolutely practice so that
Yeah.
the emotional impact is less.
Yeah, we have a
We're
few
gonna
minutes.
actually.
I don't think we fully baked off on the Kubler grief cycle, because I do think it's important. Even in the larger, more mature organizations, you can't escape the human factor.
Hmm.
And for those that don't really know what we're talking about, the Kubler-Ross grief cycle is that you've heard it all. It's the denial, it's the anger, it's the it's eventually, I forget the steps. It's been a while since we wrote the paper, and then you get to acceptance, and the reality is you can see people go through this, like they deny, like, how could this happen? I don't understand how this could happen. And then they get angry, and then they start blamestorming, like, and then they start negotiating, like, if we just pull together and work through the weekend and we work all night, we're going to get
Yeah.
through this. And invariably, those are all the worst things you can do that just exacerbate the problem. Do you have practical experience around that you've seen, that you can sort of give an illustration
Yeah.
of how that played out?
So the steps for the audience are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance.
Right.
And it was created for dealing with loss in your life. So Terry came up with this. You came up with this concept of applying that to the emotional response to ransomware, and I was fortunate enough to be able to present on that a few years ago. And the clinical application of the grief cycle is allow the victim to progress through the grief cycle at their own pace, at their own speed, because everybody's different. But when you apply it to a cybersecurity incident, you want people to get to acceptance as fast as possible
It's
because,
true.
that's where they make the best decisions. I
Hmm.
have one client story that I always use when talking about this, and it was um, a, a, a furniture company in North Carolina. They got hit with ransomware. It's a relatively small company, and the IT director had such a response that he had a panic attack, checked himself into a hospital, never met him. When I arrived the next day, I reported to the CFO, and he basically put the trust in me immediately. He's like, I don't know what to do. You have to help me through this. And so he went to acceptance immediately, and just allowed me to take over not only my team and my partner's teams, but his team as well. So I was directing the internal IT staff, the investigation, the recovery, and we got them through it in short order. We got people mobilized where a lot of times companies toil over the decision: am I going to pay too much, or is this going to cost me too much? And they worry about bringing in those stakeholders, those external stakeholders immediately. But this one didn't. He got to acceptance right away. We got the people we needed on site, and we got them recovered in short order. And so that's what I would recommend for organizations, to arrive at that acceptance stage as soon as possible. Because if you go through, all of the stages of grief, it is really going to wear on the people,
It
and it
does.
just slows
It,
down response.
people get stuck. Some people, I won't say all, get stuck in that the negotiating phase,
Hmm.
where you just try to keep pushing your organic people, that you instead of taking it, a step back and hitting that acceptance phase, and it's like, I need to bring in additional support, etc. You kind of think, if I keep pushing, I keep begging my people to work harder, we're going to get through this faster. And that's actually, it's counterintuitive, because it's actually the worst thing you could do, because people will make bad decisions, they're exhausted, they're stressed, you'll break people, and you lose objectivity very quickly.
Hmm.
And I think getting through that phase to acceptance, like you said, but the first battle is recognizing it's happening. And that's why you and I wrote the paper. It's why you and I presented it. It's like, it's, I don't think people fully appreciate that they're going through that emotional cycle while they're in it, and they certainly can't see when they're getting stuck in certain phases, where they really need to come out to that, how do I make a calm, cool, objective, and rational decision? It's only after you hit that acceptance phase, right? So
Right.
it is true. And by the way, you and I did validate this with actual crisis psychologists. We didn't just pull this one up. We came up with the idea. We did vet it, and it's academically sound. And so, but I
Yeah.
do think it's important to always consider the human factor in this.
Yeah, it was fun to research that element. And it's what we get in cybersecurity that other technologists don't get. And that's that human element. So it was a lot of fun
True.
doing that research. It was a great concept that you came up with. And yeah, I always lean back on that because
So do
it's
I.
super relevant, and it
It
always
is.
will be, as
It
long as
always will be.
humans are involved.
Exactly. That's kind of my mantra around AI. It's like, as long as there's human involved, you'll always need a human on the other side. Even
Hmm.
even if AI is making it worse or better, you're still going to need a human on the other side.
That's
So,
right.
well, and I guess that's good news for us. But
Yeah.
uh,
Job security.
hey, Tony, I can't thank you enough for being our guest here today, and I welcome you back anytime. If you come across really hot or interesting topics in your work with the X Force, please be our guest back here anytime.
Absolutely, Terry. Thanks for having me.